Um, Welcome everyone at this webinar of AEPF, the Asia Europe People's Forum. And thanks to the speakers for taking time for us. We have, I think, three important speakers that are, say, high experts and also activists at some point on the issue of debt. And we are very happy to have among us Lidy Nacpil, coordinator of the Asia People's Movement on Debt and Development, based in the Philippines. We have also Eric Toussaint, spokesperson of the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, CEDTM. You are based in Belgium, right, Eric?
Yes, but I am now in the Spanish state.
Okay. And we also have Ahilan Kadir Gamar. He's a senior sociology lecturer at Jaffna University in Sri Lanka. And myself, I'm Chris van Slambroek from 1111, also based in Belgium. And we have as co-moderator Anu Chenoy from India. We all know that, debt issue was a little bit, say, moving out of the picture for some years, but since especially the COVID crisis, it's really back on the agendas. We continue to witness country after country from the global south falling victim to the debt trap and inability to repay foreign loans. People in these countries bear the multiple burdens of indirect taxation as governments are failing to repay debts and interests to powerful governments. They pass the responsibility on the unwitting people through indirect taxes and cuts on subsidies on essential services like health and education that further impoverish the masses. It also forces governments and people to continue to depend on fossil fuels, and there's no funds to invest in renewable energies, also resort to regressive social practices and encourage displacements and migrations in search of a sustainable life. This webinar will examine the reasons for the debt, why is this crisis now erupting, and also try to explain how people put pressure to escape these cyclical debt and poverty traps. We have two rounds of questions. The first round is a bit more going in depth on what is now actually the problem, how did we get here? And I would first like to invite Ahilan to focus on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka got in a serious debt trap and in fact defaulted on its sovereign debt in May 2022. Sri Lanka was in fact the first Asian lower middle income country to get in this situation. And I would like to invite you, Ahilan, how did Sri Lanka get there, and also what is the impact on people's daily life in Sri Lanka? You have about eight minutes to get some clarification on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me on this panel. Now, there are different explanations as to why Sri Lanka got into this debt crisis. What the mainstream or what the neoclassical economists would say is that it's because in 2019, the government suddenly reduced the taxes, and therefore we got into a fiscal debt crisis, and that precipitated into this major debt crisis. And linked to that, they will also say that it's because of corruption and bad governance that Sri Lanka went into this very serious debt crisis. But I don't think that is the whole story. I think this is a much longer story of how Sri Lanka got here. Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to go through liberalization in the late 1970s. We went through two important IMF agreements in 1977 and 1978 after a prime minister who was very dictatorial, J.R. Jayawardena, created the executive presidential system in Sri Lanka, taking considerable power and pushing through neoliberal policies. Many of you might know in the 1960s and 70s, Sri Lanka was considered a model development state for the reason that even though our per capita incomes were very low, our human development indicators were very high. So Sri Lanka, Cuba, and the Indian state of Kerala were considered model development states in the 1970s. But with this change of regime in 1977, Jayawardena took us away from non-alignment towards the US-led camp and pushed through liberalization with the support of IMF and the largest development project in Sri Lanka by the World Bank. And since then, there was trade liberalization, financial liberalization, moves to privatize, to cut social welfare, and set Sri Lanka on a different path altogether, what in Sri Lanka we call open economy reforms, which led actually to a bubble-like phenomena. So from 77 to 83, there was high growth with all these capital coming in from the West. But then the bubble burst, and soon enough, the IMF was also asking for austerity measures. And what happened at that time in 1983 was that this was all deflected, the crisis, onto what became a civil war, an ethnic conflict, which was aggravated. And I actually see some link between liberalization, the crisis, and the acceleration of the ethnic conflict. We were in a protracted armed conflict for almost 2.5 decades. And then in 2009, when the civil war ended, it also coincided with the global financial crisis. And if you remember in 2007, 2008, with the global financial crisis, there was a huge amount of Western capital that was flowing into what they call the emerging markets. And Sri Lanka was not only seen as an emerging market, but also a post-conflict country. So in 2010, 11, Sri Lanka had the best performing stock market in the world, what I've called the second wave of neoliberalism for Sri Lanka, right? The first wave in the late 70s and then 2009. It's around that time, starting in 2007, Sri Lanka started to float sovereign bonds. So we actually started to go and borrow commercially in the international capital markets. And over the last decade and a half, that became more or less the majority of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. Now, these sovereign bonds, many of them 5-year terms, some of them 10-year terms, we were paying on the average interest rates of around 7.5%. So if you do the math, over a 10-year period, 7.5% interest compounded, the interest is equal to the principal, right? So our debt exponentially increased. By 2016, many of us were writing that we are headed towards a big debt crisis, because the way it happened, unfortunately, was also with the support of the IMF. In 2009, there was Sri Lanka's 15th IMF agreement. In 2016, Sri Lanka went through a 16th IMF agreement. And all along, what did the IMF want? Further liberalization, so that we can go and borrow more in the commercial markets. And along with that, there was also an increase in bilateral debt. And there was also considerable debt from China, but also Japan and India. So all of this was headed towards a crisis anyway, but the COVID crisis sort of pushed us over the cliff because we could not roll over our debt. Our tourism revenues suddenly dropped, foreign remittances dropped. And then when the war in Ukraine started, with a huge increase in global commodity prices, we went into a balance of payments problem and we defaulted on our debt. So while commonly the situation in Sri Lanka in the Western world is claimed to be due to a Chinese debt trap, if you look at actually the stock of debt, much of our debt is to commercial through borrowing. So these international sovereign bonds. So it's really either, if it's a debt trap, it's really a debt trap of global finance capital. But having defaulted, now we've had to go towards an IMF agreement, and we are really in a serious trap. Actually, I characterize the current situation in Sri Lanka as of one where Sri Lanka is in an IMF trap, because we need the IMF supposedly to get out of this default. They are the arbiter, but they are working in the interest of the external creditors, and their solution is austerity, which is further contracting the economy, where we won't even be able to create the earnings to be able to repay the debt, while they also want much of the debt to be repaid, rather than think seriously about debt cancellation or a huge reduction in the debt, which is what is necessary for Sri Lanka to come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Aylan. There was also, there's also like how do people say survive in this kind of situation where I guess prices are getting more expensive, and huge inflation, food crisis, the climate crisis. How do people say survive in this say atmosphere and in this context? Maybe can you elaborate 2 minutes on that?
Sure. This is by far the worst economic crisis Sri Lanka is going through. I would say this is a crisis of the order of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Last year, already we started implementing the IMF's recommendations, even though it took a year for the IMF to agree on the IMF agreement, pass the IMF agreement in March this year. So our economy contracted by 7.8% last year. The first 2 quarters, again, the data that we have, 11.5% and 3.1% contraction. The cost of living has gone up by 60%, but people's incomes have not gone up. For a country with a population of 22 million, 500,000 formal sector jobs have been lost. 1 million jobs in the construction sector has been lost. So there's huge amount of suffering. The cost of energy prices, because the IMF wants us to market price energy, fuel prices have tripled. Electricity cost for the bottom section of our society has tripled or quadrupled. So what are people doing? People are missing meals. In many rural parts of Sri Lanka, they're only eating 1 or 2 meals a day, but they're used to having electricity. That they're trying to keep the electricity from being cut, but that is also being cut from them. So this austerity program is devastating for ordinary people, and the government's policies and the IMF program seems to be only focused on extracting as much from the working people. The well-off, the middle classes, the local financiers, they have been let scot-free. And later maybe I can tell you a little bit about what's happened with domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka, where the only people affected are the working people and their retirement funds. Banks, non-bank finance companies, private investors, they were not touched. But the working people's retirement funds over the next 16 years is going to decline by 47%. So it is these people who are coming under attack.
Okay, thank you for that additional information. And indeed, we see that, not only Sri Lanka is in the debt crisis, but there are more Asian countries. And I would like to invite Lidy Nacpil from APMDD to shine a light on that. We all APMDD is in the forefront of advocating debt relief, debt justice, and reparations. But how do Asian governments are dealing with this debt crisis? Is it very similar to the Sri Lanka recipe, or are there also alternatives? And how do civil society? How does civil society respond to this crisis? Lidy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Of course, the Sri Lankan situation, the situation of other countries, with perhaps the exception of Pakistan, is not exactly the same as Sri Lanka right now, because we see an extreme version of the debt problem in Sri Lanka because of the default and all the reasons that contributed and led to the default, and the impacts of the international responses and the national responses to the default. And I'm saying with the exception of Pakistan, because Pakistan is kind of also on the verge of something that happened, something like what happened in Sri Lanka. But nevertheless, the other Asian countries are also deeply in the problems of debt. And if we don't address the situation urgently, it's not a far-off situation that many other countries will follow what happened to Sri Lanka and what might about to happen in Pakistan. Of course, we know that the debt burdens in many other Asian countries are huge, not just in terms of the outstanding debt that is owed, but also the huge amounts of debt service that is flowing out of the countries. The responses of the Asian governments to the debt situation is really very enraging as well as tragic, because it's not leading to any kind of long-term solutions to the debt, but in fact is putting us deeper in debts. Although we cannot fault the borrowing countries, the Asian governments. Primarily, this is an international problem that is the result of many structural, deeply embedded problems in the global economy, in the global financial system. Historically, I know that we should go back to the how globalization and neoliberal globalization policies, like Dr. Ahilan has just explained how it has led to this situation. But we really need to go back further into history. In fact, the history of colonialism in many of our countries, and how the colonial experience and the colonial legacy has put us in a situation that we are now deeply indebted, and we are still facing this continuing problem of the debt despite many decades of so-called debt relief measures from lenders. And that is what is shaping the response of many Asian movements. But just to go back, of course, I'll go back to this historical and structural roots to explain how we are responding. But just to go back to how are Asian governments responding to the debt crisis. Well, the first thing there is that all Asian governments are striving to pay debts in full and on time. There's a huge refusal to acknowledge that they are having debt problems. This is not just the case in Asia. This is the case in many other southern countries in other regions. And this is because acknowledging that you have a debt problem will affect your access to new loans, will affect your credit rating. And because governments are choosing the easy path of continuing to borrow in order to solve liquidity problems or the tight fiscal space, to solve insolvency problems like what has happened to Sri Lanka, which led to the default. They're not wanting to affect their ability to access to loans. So you've had cases where in the past there were debt relief measures being offered, and some of the Asian governments whose countries could have been eligible or were eligible to this debt relief refused to say that they are having debt problems, and even refuse the debt relief, no matter how limited or flawed, could have been an opportunity to have some ease. This has led to them actually saying, "Oh no, we're not going. We don't have debt problems. We're okay, right?" So that's I can cite a number of examples, including that of my government, when a few years back there was that opportunity, and they said they don't have any problems, and then some few years later, one of the things they did when the international reserves were in a good shape, they just fully paid the loans to the IMF instead of prioritizing public services. The second, of course, response, which is consistent with the first, is they continue to avail of the loans being pushed by the international community, especially in the last few years, as a response to the multiple crises. I mean, this is how the international lenders community, both public and private, their knee-jerk reaction to crisis, whether it's COVID or now the climate, is to offer more loans, and to offer more loans as a solution and as a crisis response. So one of our responses has been to really call for the refusal of loans as crisis responses, because this is not just, it's not solving the crisis, multiple crises, and leading us into deeper debts. One of the most latest example is in responding to the climate crisis, the international community is now talking about mobilizing in the trillions and putting at center stage the multilateral development banks as the channels for this financial responses. And we know they are banks, their main business is lending, so you can expect an avalanche of money for new loans, many of which are not going to be offered in concessional or highly concessional terms, but in terms of market-based rates. So they caused the climate crisis, the global north, and then they're going to want us to respond to the climate crisis by offering us more loans, and which we will pay back even with interest. The third response, part of the response, is similar to what the Sri Lankan government, although of course it's not quite as simple as that, there's also dynamics, is to comply with IMF conditionalities and other MDB conditionalities as part of addressing the debt problem. Because again, this complying with conditionalities are conditionalities to access to credit, and even conditionalities of debt relief are being complied with, because they're not only wanting to access the debt relief, they also want to remain in the good graces of the IMF, which I know all of us know is still the main gatekeeper for the flow of credit, because they are the ones that are defining or determining or giving signals as to which countries are properly managing their economies, which countries in the south, but not only in the south, but also in the north. We had the Eurozone debt crisis, for instance, where the IMF played an active role in terms of providing the conditionalities in exchange for IMF packages and in exchange for private lenders to continue lending. And in terms of our responses, we really need to have responses, and that's what we're striving to build, and to build political momentum for, again, especially since, as you said, Chris, for a few years, the debt issue took a back seat. We, of course, didn't believe that it should take a back seat, but took a back seat in terms of international community attention. We need to have a response that is not just addressing the immediate urgency of the debt problem, but its historical roots, its structural roots. It's important to understand the historical and structural roots in order to have long-term and enduring solutions that will really allow us to save ourselves from this perpetual problem of the debt. The structural and historical roots, as I said, goes back to the colonial period. It's a legacy of colonialism. It's how colonialism and globalization has led to very inequitable economic and financial relations across countries, including relations and transactions in finance, in lending and borrowing. We need to be very aware that this is not the propensity of Southern governments to borrow, but what others would call supply-driven lending, the aggressive pushing of loans by both public and private lenders. It's also how our economies in the South have been structured so that our economies are really not being run in order to respond to or address domestic needs, but the needs and the roles assigned to us by the global market and by the global North, who were many of our former colonizers. So it's resulting in a, not just in terms of debt, but on many other fronts, trade and others, in a net resource transfer of trillions of dollars every year from the South to the North. So it's no wonder why our economies are impoverished. We're left with very problematic fiscal resources. Even if you do a lot of changes in your domestic resource mobilization, unless you address the structural roots, unless you stop the bleeding of our economies because our wealth is going from South to North, then there will always be that justification to borrow and to continue to borrow. And of course, it's not just a problem of paying, it's also the injustice of many of these loans being pushed for what we would call illegitimate reasons, so, and how they were pushed on illegitimate terms. So we're not only talking about unsustainable debts, but we're also talking about illegitimate debts. Even if we had the money to pay, why should we pay for debts that did not benefit people? In fact, many of these were used to finance projects that have been very harmful. One of the examples of which were fossil fuel projects. The world is coming to consensus. We need to phase out fossil fuel energy. But what about all the loans that were incurred because the North pushed all these fossil fuel projects on the South? So we should stop paying for these loans that have led to such harmful consequences. So our response has been first to remind ourselves that our strategic call is total debt cancellation that should be unconditional for all loans, regardless of who lend, for all public loans from both public and private lenders and creditors. I mean, we can craft some immediate policy measures that can be fought for in this immediate condition, but our strategic direction is to make sure that all of these loans are canceled. But on the other hand, cancellation is a creditor act. We're calling on our governments to stop paying these unsustainable and illegitimate loans, illegitimate debts, and prioritize the needs of the country. An intentional act of stopping to pay for very clear reasons of justice is different from simply defaulting, right? So we're not saying that, you just go on a default. We're saying to very actively, scrutinize our loans, stop paying for those unsustainable, unjust, and illegitimate, and transform our borrowing and payment policies, and also to have very major reforms in how the international community is conducting lending and the terms that go into lending, the conditionalities that go into lending. So there's all this range of issues that we're addressing through various campaigns. We need to understand that this is a strategic fight. This is not just a fight for the next few months or the next couple of years, and then we move on to other issues. We've been working on this problem for decades, and we really need to step up. And especially now, since we're facing crises which have a limited time frame, we're dealing with the climate crisis that if we don't solve it in the next few years and in the next couple of decades, we're going to be facing planetary catastrophe. So we really need to restructure our economies, prioritize our spending, and make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And some of those are continuing today. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Lidy. That was very clear and very concise. I would also like to invite Eric because we all know that, in fact, the concrete, say, event that led to this webinar is, in fact, next week, the World Bank annual meetings taking place in Marrakesh. But there is, from civil society, there is also a counter summit that is also taking place in Marrakesh. And in fact, yeah, very symbolically, the counter summit will start on October 12th. In fact, the date of the arrival in the Caribbean of Columbus and his expedition, which paved the way for the conquest, pillage, and exploitation of the American continent by European imperialism from 1492 onwards. And also symbolically, the counter summit will end on October 15, the date of the assassination of Thomas Sankara, the ex-president of Burkina Faso at the time, who led the fight for the non-payment of illegitimate debts and for the unity of the peoples of Africa and in the world. So, like Lidy mentioned, this has been already a long struggle to have this, let's say, long-term strategies on debt and how this is financed and how countries are organizing their financial infrastructure. Eric, what do you expect from the Counter Summit? Can you explain a bit more how you have been preparing the summit and what actually will take place in Marrakesh? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm very happy to be with you. I totally agree with what Ahilan said about the Sri Lankan, the causes, the reason for the Sri Lankan crisis. It's very important to share the analysis he gave about the Sri Lankan crisis because there are a lot of lies and a lot of disorientation that we can understand. People think that the major reason are the corruption of the regime in Sri Lanka, when in reality it's part of the problem, but the reason are others. And that's the reason why also other countries in the South are confronted with a very huge problem now of repayment of debt. And I totally agree with Lidy about the necessity of the full abolition, full annulation of the debt reclaimed to the global South. I am also very happy that several people who are participating to this online conference today will travel to Marrakesh and will co-organize the Counter Summit. Lidy will be there and has actively participate with a network to the preparation, to the inclusive preparation of this Counter Summit. I see that Sushovandar, Abdul Khalik are also part in the public of this online conference and will travel to Marrakesh. We began the preparation reality of this Counter Summit 3 years ago because the World Bank and the IMF announced 4 years ago that they will organize the annual conference. They said that we'll do it in 2022. They postponed until 2023 because of the pandemics. And so we began the contact with other networks, etc. And first in Morocco to be in contact with social movement in Morocco. to have I would say, an endogenous process of preparation of the counter summit, because we have to avoid a situation in which networks and NGO are going from one country to another, organizing counter summit without the contact of the real social movement in the same countries. So there has been a active preparation with social movement in Morocco and in the Arabic region, sub-Saharan continent also, and of course Asia, Latin America, and Europe. So it was an inclusive process. There has been a call launched in January with the idea to rewrite a common call through an inclusive process. This new call was written in April, May. We have a common website for the Counter Summit. We had an inclusive preparation. This means that all the organizations and networks who were supporting the Counter Summit had the possibility to register workshop, conferences, and so we will have 60 workshops and conferences during 2 days of Counter Summit, because the first day, the 12th, we will have a march, open march, and a plenary assembly. The second day will begin so the 13th, we will have 30 workshops and conferences and 1 plenary at 4 p.m. The 14th, we will have another round of workshop with 30 workshop and plenary assembly. And the last day, so the 15th, a plenary assembly to gather all the proposal, the initiative for the future, and conclusion plenary of the Counter Summit. We will organize it in difficult conditions, not only because of the horrible earthquake which happened the 23 of September last month, but also because the monarchy is very repressive. And the comrade of APMDD in Morocco, for instance, has no personal, juridical existence. They cannot receive money from other countries. The comrades are repressed. One of the comrades of attacks in Morocco has been condemned to 6 years sentence of jail. He already completed 3 years. He appealed the decision, but he didn't succeed in his appeal. So the situation is complicated. But at the same time, we know that the monarchy will not create problem with people coming from outside, because it's very important for them, their reputation as a pseudo-democratic open country. But the situation will be complicated because we will denounce the policy of Europe in relation with the rights of the migrants and the rights of the refugees, and the complicity of the Moroccan regime with Europe, with the Spanish state in repressing the people who want to go through the channel between Morocco and Spain to to succeed in entering Europe. We will denounce the non-respect of the right of self-determination of the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara. We will denounce what this monarchy is doing as a little sub-imperial power in the region, because the monarchy is very active financially through different banks in countries of the Sahel, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and other countries of the region. Of course, this counter summit is very important to denounce what the IMF and World Bank are doing, because as you know, Chris, and all the people in this conference know that permanently the World Bank and IMF are saying we have changed, we have understood the wrong things, the mistakes we did, and now we are struggling. The World Bank is saying we are struggling against climate change. We are for the empowerment of women. We are in favor of reducing poverty and the participation of the civil society. All these type of lies they are saying to the people and to the media since the last 30 years, because they already began 30 years ago saying that we have changed, that's not anymore the Washington consensus, but it's a participatory process involving civil society in struggling against poverty and climate change, etc. Yes, that's basically what I have to say about this counter. So maybe, Chris, if I have 2 minutes to explain the reason of the new international debt crisis, I can do it, but I don't know if I have still time. I don't listen to you.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. I muted. I was muted. Sorry. Well, we can maybe take that in the second round. Let's see how things are evolving. We should also keep some time for questions. Thank you, Erik, for also your take on the counter summit and explaining a bit about the process. Unfortunately, I cannot join, but one of my colleagues here at 1111 will join in Marrakesh.
Excellent.
Yes. So for the second round, I would like to go back to Dr. Ahilan. Yeah, we were talking about Sri Lanka, the impact, the context, but also I would like to ask you, how do social movements in Sri Lanka advocate on the debt crisis? How do they react? How do they and also do they have the room, the space, the civic space to take action? What are their calls? Is there a kind of engagement, a dialogue with the current government, or is it very hard for, say, debt justice advocates to speak out? I would like to know a bit more about that, and I think also the rest of our audience. You have 5 minutes, Ahilan, to explain us a bit more about the social movements reply to this debt crisis in the country.
Yeah. So all of you would have seen that, Sri Lanka had massive protests last year from April into July, and the president at that time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, even had to flee the country. And so there was a lot of concern among the people about this severe economic crisis that was affecting them. But once the president fled, there was what I would call a counter-revolution with the remnants of that same regime who had a majority in parliament, electing an interim president, who's now our president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, and then unleashing tremendous repression on protesters. So they went after all the activists, particularly the working class youth from the urban areas who were in the forefront of the protests, arresting thousands of them, going after trade unions. So we have an illegitimate parliament, a president who was elected by that parliament, and the neoliberal think tanks and the capitalist class in Sri Lanka saying the only way forward is through an IMF program. Because when they saw all these people going into even the presidential palace, the presidential secretariat, it sent sort of shockwaves through the ruling class, if you may, because they felt now they're taking over public property, and next might be private property, right? So this illegitimate president has the backing of the elite in the country. And Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was president before that, he fled the country. He was a ruthless defense secretary and led the civil war, and he was a war hero that kept the military with him. And suddenly the military was, their war hero had fled the country. So now they are beholden to this regime to protect them as well. So it is this regime that has no legitimacy, backed by the military and with severe repression, that they are ruling the country. Every month they are bringing out a new law. Now they are trying to pass through an anti-terrorism act. They're trying to crack down on online and social media through a new online bill, a new broadcasting bill. So they're going after dissent in every form. And so the strong protest that was there, which was really not led by any particular group, there was no vanguard to that. It was very much a people-centered uprising is what I call it, or a revolt. And now it is, the repression and the sort of dissipation of it. And we are kind of waiting as to how people are going to go through this crisis. So in terms of ordinary people who are in the forefront of it, they're also dealing with day-to-day issues. How do they give food to their children? Their children's education is disrupted. They're unable to find work. So they're dealing with these day-to-day issues. There's a smaller core of trade unions and social activists who are trying to challenge this trajectory. Most recently, when there was domestic debt restructuring, there were protests because, as I mentioned, it was going after working people's savings. But what, at least in my experience, I have found is that this is the difficulty of, explaining how debt and finance works to ordinary people, right? So I think we have to do a lot of work, because this debt crisis is not just for Sri Lanka. It's going to affect many parts of the world, but the way in which the corporate media, the elite think tanks, they basically said there is no other path but the IMF path, which is more of financialization and more of dispossession, right? So how do we explain this process to the broader people? So even in Sri Lanka, the trade unions and the social movements have a huge task ahead to explain that the path that we're headed in, what I mentioned, the economy is completely collapsing in terms of the contraction. And all that the IMF is trying to do is to make sure through these deflationary policies that Sri Lanka repays its creditors as much as it can. That is the only interest. But how do we explain that to the people, and how do we come up with an alternate economic trajectory? Now, some of us have been proposing the need for also huge redistribution within Sri Lanka through a wealth tax, for example, right? That right now the working people are being made to pay for the accumulation and the odious debt of the state and the wealthy. and how do we change that trajectory where it is the wealthy in the country should be asked to foot the bill, and these huge bondholders and multilateral creditors that have already extracted so much from Sri Lanka, and not only over the last 40 years, as Lidy said, for centuries, because Sri Lanka was colonized for almost 4.5 centuries, first by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. So that message and how this extraction happens through finance and debt, I think we have a lot of work to do in Sri Lanka to work with the people and get them to understand this so that we find another way out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, yeah, debt issue is indeed a very complex issue, and yeah, it's very difficult to grasp. I think Lidy can also confirm that, and you also explained that, in fact, also in your first contribution about the long struggle that is already ongoing. You also attend and speak at numerous international events on finance for a just and fair development. Do you feel with this new crisis that there is some new momentum growing? Are indebted countries getting somehow together to build a common position? Yeah, is there a kind of a common agenda building versus their creditors? How do you look at that, Lidy, from an international perspective?
Well, I think on the positive side, there is definitely growing momentum among movements. No, so there is a renewal of efforts. Not that it completely disappeared, but so many movements like CADTM, like us, many movements have really continued to persevere on the debt front, but there was a considerable also decline in activity around debt, even among movements and NGOs for a number of years. So I'm quite happy to acknowledge that movements are now regaining strength and momentum in campaigning, and I wish that were the same positive development among governments in terms of gaining momentum on approaches that are not just a repeat of the past approaches, right? Approaches that are not by the book as it has been for a number of years. We have some positive signs, for instance, some governments who are really feeling the crunch that are taking on more bold positioning on this. I guess somewhat also positive, but not as much, is the fact that some governments among developing countries are also trying to explore other means of reducing debt payments, for instance. But some of these approaches are very slippery slopes. Like, for instance, a kind of renewed interest on debt swaps is there, but we don't usually advocate for debt swaps because there's a lot of dangers in debt swaps, and so the devil is in the details. And a more justice-based approach is to really have a critical examination of our debts. A debt audit is what we have been calling for, so that we just really stop paying for the unjust debts. The debt swaps, you will pay it, except that it's going to be in other ways, not exactly in debt service, but you're still going to shell out funds depending on what you are swapping it with. And the other issue there is, if you go into a debt swap, you're actually acknowledging that that particular debt is a legitimate one, and therefore you will go into that kind of an arrangement with the creditors, and you can't question that debt anymore in the future, right? So before anything else, debt swaps and the like, there has to be a complete and critical examination of this debt. But nevertheless, I think the renewed concern and interest of governments to take up debt, even on the part of the lenders, which are, of course, usually also, expectedly also going down the market route, and the route that is actually in the interest of lenders. Their interest is that, number one, you continue to pay, or if you're unable to pay, they want to clean your books so you can borrow again. No, so that was the history of HIPIC, the history of MDRI, all this previous debt relief. I mean, there was even a forum some years ago when an IMF speaker next to me was saying, you know, our interest in this HIPIC is so that these African countries can borrow again from new lenders. And that is code speak for so that they can borrow from the international financial markets and not on concessional or highly concessional terms. And this was actually verified by what unfolded in the following years. The same African countries that availed of HIPIC started borrowing again, and there's a larger mix of their debt that is from financial markets on market-based terms. So I still consider this positive in the sense that now there is an acknowledgement that there is a debt problem. It is a first step in really asserting for the right kind of solutions. At least there is that acknowledgement. So there is some channels that have opened up in the UN, in multilateral discussions, even in the World Bank and the IMF, how to deal with this, the debt problem. But we really need to change the terms of the debate. We can't just accept the terms of the debate that's being defined by these multilateral institutions and by the lenders.
Okay, thank you, Lidy. Eric, if we are looking at Europe, and as we are in the Asia-Europe People's Forum here, what is your message to the leaders in Europe just at the dawn of the World Bank annual meeting? How can Europe contribute to a more fair and balanced relationship between the global South to overcome this global crisis they are facing? What is your message? I would like to hear from you.
Well, first I would say we cannot have any illusion about what European government wants to do in relation with the policies implemented or imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. In all the discussion inside the IMF and the World Bank, inside the United, the UN, the European countries powers are supporting the most negative position. For instance, when Argentina in 2015 raised the question of the debt and the renegotiation on that, the European countries said we will abstain or vote against Argentina proposal, and we propose that the IMF should be the institution in charge of the question of the debt negotiation. So we cannot have any illusion. I think our message to the European Union, I am now in the Spanish state because just now in Granada, in Andalusia, take place a summit of the European Union. And I participate to a conference 2 days before, and yesterday there was a march against the policies of the leaders of the European Union about the right of the migrants, the question of debt. We are saying that all the European government should cancel the debt reclaim to the global South, but we know that state will not do that. We ask the European government not to keep on with the war in Ukraine, because you know that they are using Ukraine as a proxy war, and they are increasing the military expenses and their own coordination inside NATO with US imperialism. they are imposing commercial agreements to the global south, which are totally contrary to the interest of the people of the global south, but also of the global north, because the people of the north are also the victims of the ecological world crisis, the economical crisis, the effect of the pandemics on the population, not only of the south, but also of the north, so that the popular classes of Europe should understand that we need to create a common mobilization of the peoples of the south and the north to impose big changes, structural reform. At this level, we don't have any illusion of the capacity of the mood in the IMF and the World Bank to change really the things. They want to maintain the capacity of imposing the type of neoliberal policy they imposed since the third world debt crisis of the 80s. And so the message we have to launch in relation with the government of Europe is that they should totally change their policy and listen to the people who will gather during the Counter Summit in Marrakesh, and the people there will propose new solution or support all solution, but to give more support to this solution around the full cancellation of the debt and fundamental changes to confront the ecological crisis. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Eric, for that excellent explanation. So we'll have a round of questions and answers. First, we'll take all the questions together, then I will give each of the panelists 2 minutes to answer and sum up, and then I will do a general summing up. So I think the first speaker in this question and answer session is our friend from Pakistan, Farooq. So Farooq?
Yeah, thank you. I think the question of debt is really interlinked with many other crises in Pakistan at present time. It has led to price hike, it has led to more privatization, it has led to more lending, it has made people's life absolutely miserable, because the successive governments in Pakistan, from Imran Khan to present caretaker government, they are fanatically trying to repay the loans which Pakistan owns at this time, $124 billion. And today there was a report that it is 28% more borrowing they have done during the last financial year. So they just want to lend and then doesn't care how that has been paid. They just want to increase the indirect taxation, which has been one of their main vehicle to raise funds. So my question really is, Pakistan is on the way as Sri Lanka was at one time, and fanatically Pakistani ruling class are trying to avoid Sri Lankan situation. So what do you think, Eric and Lidy particularly, and also our friend Helen, about Pakistan going the same way as Sri Lanka did? Also, I would just like to say that people are saying Sri Lanka is different and they have survived. But if Pakistan go into default, it will never survive. So that sort of comments we usually hear from the activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Farooq. There's one question from Zayuddin Islam, who says, it is in the question box, that too many volume of this, I suppose too much volume of debt is obviously a strong reason for a country's crisis. But may I ask for a discussion on the negative impacts because of poor governance and massive corruption by the rulers? So this is one question in the chat box, which I guess all of you can answer. But if there are any other questions, please do put it out. Yeah, there's one from Mehnaz Rahman, which says, what solutions do you suggest for Pakistan? How can we adopt pro-people policies? So now there are two issues on Pakistan, but I think it's also very general. Any other questions? We do have time for all of you to ask a few more questions. You can type it in, or if you really want to speak, you can switch on your speaker mode for a minute and also speak. So I'm not getting any other question. So Eric, would you like to start by answering these two, I think, very important questions?
Okay, yes. So the question of default, I would say the big medias and the government and the majority of economists are saying a default is a catastrophe. In reality, a default could be used by a government to impose to the creditors to renounce to a part of all they want to recover from the country. When Sri Lanka entered in default, the price of the bonds, Sri Lankan bonds, went down
That's right.
60–70%. It was this situation could be a positive situation for a government, a leftist, a progressive government who want to use the situation. It's what the government, the progressive government of Ecuador did in 2009. First, in 2007, they organized an audit of the debt reclaimed to the country. SCADTM and other network will participate to this audit, which was inclusive with the social movement of Ecuador, the indigenous coalition of the nation, the CONAI, the feminist movement, the ecological movement. We presented our conclusion to the government of Ecuador in September 2008, and Ecuador decided to suspend, to enter in default. And after 6 months, the price of the bonds was around 20% of the face value of the bonds. And the government decided to buy back this bond at this price, 20% of the value of the bonds, and did not enter in negotiation with the World Bank, with the IMF, they impose to the creditors, they say to the creditors, either you have the solution to sell to us the bonds at a discount price of 35% of the face value of the bonds, either you will not be paid because we are in suspension of payment. And they convinced 91% of the bondholders to sell these bonds. So I say, in contradiction to what the mainstream economists and commentators and government are saying, a default could be an opportunity for a country to force its creditors to make concession, very important concession to the country. But of course, if you decide, as Ilan said, like the government made last year, to go immediately to the IMF, and what is exactly what the Pakistani government has done this year, to go to the IMF, to make a new agreement, you will enter in recreating the condition of the situation of total submission, subordination to the creditors. So there is an alternative, but the alternative is to oppose the solution proposed by the creditors and to enter so in confrontation with them, with the possibility of a victory against these creditors.
Thank you, Eric. Now, there are two other questions. One from an anonymous attendee who's saying, where may we find resources that we may use to raise public awareness about debt management in our country? And a second question by Jacinta Higgs, who's asking, do you have resources to teach students about this vexing concern? So I think I'll ask Ahilan first to answer, and also if there's anything left over that he'd like to say after that I'll ask Lidy. Ahilan?
Yeah, thank you. On this, the question of default, I think what is important is the politics of the default, right? Whether there is a progressive government, is there a strong enough movement that is ready to take the economy on a different path. Now, my analysis of Sri Lanka as a default is that we actually didn't even have to default at that particular moment in April, right? I even call it a premature default because there was a huge push from the right to say that we should default and then we should go to the IMF and then restructure our debt, and we will be able to again go back to the markets. That was what they wanted, and that is what they are doing now. So, and because they felt once Sri Lanka defaults, then we would be in the sort of chokehold of the IMF, and which is what we are now. In fact, the IMF agreement, if you look at it, the 4-year agreement, the end point, they say Sri Lanka will be able to go to the capital markets and borrow another $1.5 billion US, right? So that is the whole part of this IMF agreement. In reality, what is happening to Sri Lanka's finances? What the IMF has given us over 4 years, it only covers 3% of our import bill over those 4 years. It's peanuts. So why go to the IMF? The country is still running on the foreign earnings of the working people of Sri Lanka. The women who work in the garment sector, the women who work in the tea plantations, the people who go as migrant labor, they are the ones still paying for the imports of the country. So if there was a strong enough movement and a government that said and did what exactly Eric suggested, that we say, okay, we are not going to, at least let's target the bondholders first. We won't repay any of our commercial borrowing, and we don't want to go back to the sovereign, capital markets. But that's what got us to the crisis. We don't want to go back, so we don't have to pay them back. If we have a strong movement like that, then we could go on another path. But the danger is that the default and its politics can be used towards further austerity, towards privatization. That's where Sri Lanka is headed, and that's where Pakistan might be headed as well. Once they default, they say, oh, we have no foreign currency, we need to privatize, we need foreign capital to come and purchase all our public services. That is the direction in which this debt crisis is being pushed. So I think that the politics of the default is very important. In terms of resources, I think CADTM, their website is a great resource. I also go there to get a lot of information to be able to, I'm also a university teacher to teach my students. And there's also the International Development Economics Associates Network, their website, where they also post some counter analysis to the mainstream, because the economic establishment and economics teaching has become so complicit with capital and the IMF and the World Bank that we really need to search for these alternate analysis and ways of understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahilan. So there's one more question which is similar from Dr. Jacinta Higgs. And she says, do you have a document with the proposals and goals of your organizations that we may share with all civil society organizations? So I think the best person really to answer this is Lidy. And anything else, Lidy, that you want to add, please go ahead. Thank you, Lidy.
Yeah, so yeah, in our website, there are a number of materials, the apmdd.org website. I know CADTM also has a lot of materials in their website, so Eric can also share the website of CADTM. Plus, if you write to us, we can send you PowerPoint materials and our Asia Debt Bulletin, which I'm not quite sure are all on the website already at this point. So please do write to us. I'm going to type my email address on the chat so we can send materials. And I think a lot of them, if you Google CADTM and APMDD materials from other debt groups like the Debt Justice UK also has a wealth of materials that can be shared by everyone, to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's left for me to do a summing up of this, I think, really excellent webinar with wonderful speakers and great comments and questions. So I think there were 3 parts to this. One which showed why the debt and its and all its the reasons. The second, which was about the people's responses, and the third part on the strategies. So the first really, the first kind of part which all the speakers spoke, one, they argued that the root causes of debt really lie in the neoliberal policies of privatization, and countries started getting deeply indebted. Many countries which were doing quite well started getting indebted after these policies were introduced. Of course, this is not to say that past issues, whether it was neocolonialism or whether how the domestic governments handled the economic policies, they were equally or also substantially to blame. So what kind of policies plus the neoliberalism, the government policies could have been like too much infrastructure, a decrease in taxes as in Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. The second was point overall, which all speakers agreed to, were that when governments were falling into debt or foreign exchange crises, they were going to the IMF for loans and to commercial sector for loans, and the IMF, the conditionality was generally austerity. And this austerity was linked to more privatization, to cutting down on social sector spending, and basically it was pushing people downwards while it was saving the elite. So I think Ahilan gave it a good name, that we should not just call it debt crisis, it's an IMF-led debt crisis. So it's an IMF debt crisis. And there's a culture of austerity with it. The third point was that this, governments often, and people also, the general narrative they blame all kinds of things for the debt crisis. For example, they say it's corruption. In South Asia, I've noticed they say, oh, it's China's fault. You know, they've got all the African countries into debt crisis. But the fact is that it is a mix. The government, they have a mix of debt from the IMF, from commercial, from private, from buying, selling sovereign bonds, etc. So there is this basket of debt, which really they can be a multiple, and it's also they can have multiple responses. And I think Eric showed that very well, as did Lidy, that this wealth is going from south to north, whereas governments can do various things to handle this crisis and avoid austerity. The second set of answers were linked to social, the response from communities, from people, etc. And it was shown how people have tried to resist this, you know, depending on the level of response, sometimes breaking out into almost a revolution, as in Sri Lanka, huge demonstrations, as in Pakistan and many African countries. You want people just, you know, and these are very often spontaneous, though in many places the trade unions and civil society organizations and NGOs are also with it. I know Lidy, for example, has had huge demonstrations, led huge demonstrations on debt. So the civil society has done as much as they could. And Eric explained how the Marrakesh meeting of, you know, countering the World Bank positions is going to be held, and we look forward to the outcomes on that. And the third part were really our strategic responses. And very quickly, I think there were five very smart strategic responses. One is that we ask for debt cancellation. Two, that our own governments should stop giving back unsustainable and unjust debt. I mean, I'm just adding my own example. For example, if a bank fails, no one holds them accountable for not paying back those who have invested in that bank. So why should governments keep adding to their debt and going back to the IMF? Like Sri Lanka's gone 17 times, I think Pakistan's gone maybe 30 times, and taking on more and more debt. So third, I think there needs to be a redistributive wealth tax. Ahilan has argued for that earlier and now. Fourth, that there should be laws and ways to prevent governments from taking from the funds of the most vulnerable, let's say pension funds or education funds. They shouldn't make those also part of their debt repayment. So I think all our speakers agreed that there should be a justice-based approach to repaying debt. And I think Lidy's been arguing for a debt audit. Maybe all of you should get together along with us to do this kind of debt audit. And I think Eric put it very well, this intersectionality of debt. You know, if you're having so much military spending and you're still asking for more debt and you continue, so change your security policies, change your threat perceptions, you know, look at how climate impacts. So basically, I think all of y'all and what we endorse is arguing for pro-people and justice and social justice-based debt policies. So I thank all of you. We've had a very successful webinar. We've had 58 people joining online and many more on our Facebook Live. We had over 80 registrations, so I think 50 joining was a good number. And in addition, we have recorded this. Thank you for allowing us to record it. And this will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel, APF website and YouTube channel, for anyone who wants to access it for any time to come. We can share this with whoever wants the recording. So thank you very much. And that's where we will close. A special thanks to our speakers and my co-moderator, Chris. And of course, Bishnu Singh and Hasnain for doing, as usual, all the tech backup, the posters, the push for advocacy for this webinar, and to Farooq also. Thank you very much.